Good morning. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. I'd like to welcome you all and thank you so much for joining this conversation. I'm Katie Smith from the Alliance for Innovative Regulation, or AIR, as most people call us. And I've got the great pleasure of moderating today's panel. We're going to be talking about AI ethics. Before we get going, just a couple of housekeeping things. Please be aware that the session is being recorded today. We won't be taking any voice comments or questions in this session. And although we don't have a Q&A this time round, I would really like to encourage you to use the chat to provide feedback on the session. We do plan to have some more sessions on this topic. So if you've got thoughts around what you'd like to hear more about, if you found something interesting, please do let us know about that in the chat and we'll try to incorporate it into any future sessions that we're going to have on this subject. So today I'm joined by a really fantastic panel and they're going to introduce themselves shortly. As most of you can imagine, ethics in relation to AI is really an enormous topic, and we could cover an awful lot. We could talk about the potential impact on jobs and work. We could talk about the risk of AI being used for mass manipulation. We could talk to the environmental concerns, things like power, resources required for these systems. So there's a lot of things that could be covered in this particular subject. We also know that words such as ethical, responsible, and safe AI are all very relevant terms, but they're often intertwined and they can be used a bit interchangeably. So what we're not going to try to do today is to resolve this or discuss terminology. And it's safe to say that a number of those terms you're probably going to hear come up during the course of this panel. And as we only have an hour today, we've decided to narrow our focus and really look at something that we think is quite pressing for our audience. Namely, how should they start to consider ethical questions and responses when they're thinking about either buying, building, or overseeing AI and generative AI technology in the work that they're doing? Okay, so let's get to it. Firstly, I would really like the panel to introduce themselves very briefly. Can I come to you first, please, teacher?
Thank you so much, Katie, and really excited to be here on this panel. I'm Pratiksha Vasisht, joining in from New Delhi, India. I am currently co-founder and lead researcher at the Pranava Institute. We are a research organization that works at the intersection of emerging tech policy and society in India. We work on a host of issues, including DPI, including ethics of AI, and trust and safety issues. Glad to be here.
Thanks, Teacher. Mike, can I ask you to give a quick intro?
Yes, hello everyone. I'm Dr. Mike Cattell, and I'm an ethics fellow in the public policy program at the Alan Turing Institute. The Alan Turing Institute is the UK's national institute for artificial intelligence and data science. I work on a team in which we do a couple of things. The main thing is we provide various kinds of advice and policy guidance for UK government departments and agencies. We also work with multilateral institutions like UNESCO and the Council of Europe in developing AI governance frameworks. We also do what I would call basic research and thinking more broadly about the ethics, the ethical requirements, the ethics, the moral questions that arise through automated systems and a datafied society. And I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks very much, Mike. Megan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Great to be here. I'm Dr. Megan Ma. I am the Associate Director at the Stanford Center for Legal Informatics. We like to say that unlike other research centers in law schools, we actually straddle between law and CS. And so accordingly, we kind of build technology for law. And part of that endeavor means that we have to think about the technical safeguards and thinking about what types of guardrails we need to integrate in that process. So again, thrilled to be here.
Great, thank you very much. And Rachel.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Wells. I'm with DataKind, Senior Manager of Community Programs, and my role at DataKind is focused on enabling social impact organizations with data science and AI skills, specifically focused on ensuring equitable and accountable usage.
Great, thank you. And Patrick, if you'd like to introduce yourself, please.
Hi, everyone. I'm Patrick Vergara. I'm the COO at NormAI. At NormAI, we're building regulatory AI agents to interpret laws and regulations and help businesses meet regulatory compliance obligations. My background is in software, AI, and law. I have a law degree from Stanford, and I've spent the past many years building software companies in the AI space, and am excited to contribute to the discussion.
Right. Well, thank you all for agreeing to share your perspectives today. And I'm going to get us started. We've actually got quite a lot of questions to get through. We'll see how we go and we'll see how many we get to. But the first one is really a very, very broad question. So I wanted to ask our panel to think about what actually are those key ethical questions that are raised by advancing AI in our financial ecosystems, and ask them to kind of respond thinking a bit about what are the risks that are new, what are the risks that might be compounded, and how might we start thinking about the relevance of fair and ethical practices. Basically, what should we be worrying about and why? So if I could ask Mike, if you could start us off, please.
Sure. I mean, it's such a big question. And there are not concise answers, but I'll do my best. But I'd say the main question that I think arises in something as important as the financial marketplace and financial services is a question of accountability. And of course, that spreads out in so many ways. I'm sure that the legal scholars on the group will talk about thinking about consumer safety and liability questions. But accountability is a core ethical principle that cuts to the heart of virtually all of these endeavors. Because if something goes wrong, we want to know who is responsible. We want to be able to assign responsibility. We want to be able to do that appropriately. And this is something that this is an idea or a priority in really all of our sort of interactions and relationships, specifically business relationships in the world. But it's particularly important when dealing with AI, because AI makes the scope of assigning and identifying accountable people and assigning responsibility more complicated, in part because what we tend to use systems like any kind of technical system like AI for is to scale up the scope of the kind of work we're doing. Right. So if we use AI in financial services, what we're trying to do is we're trying to do things that humans are capable of doing, but are not capable of doing at such a scale and scope as AI can do it. And what that fans out in two different directions. That means that things that people are good at doing, AI may be able to do better, but things that that AI or people are bad at doing, AI may be able to do much worse. And when we apply AI in this sort of dimension of exploding scale and scope, then the goods amplify and the bads amplify. And so we may reap tremendous benefits, but the prospect of tremendous harms also goes up a great deal. Another thing that makes accountability crucial, but also much harder, is that the way automated systems work is they're increasingly sophisticated, complicated. They use much more diverse forms of inputs, forms of data. There are many more actors involved. You have more technical people involved, technical teams. Often AI systems are not a single system, but there are several systems that are sort of put together into a package. And there are people who had hands-on and decisions that were made in constructing a lot of the systems, including systems that weren't necessarily designed to be used in the way they're now being used to make this package, this big automated package. And as you create these more and more complex systems, you find that you have more and more actors to identify and to account for and to try to determine their levels of responsibility. So I'll just leave it there and just say that I think accountability is probably the biggest and most challenging question in the ethics of AI and financial services. But it's not the only one, but it's a big one.
Thank you, Mike. I think that's really good background to paint the picture really well. Teacher, I wonder if you would think to add something to that in terms of your focus on kind of public deployment of AI in the Indian market, and if you would add anything to what.
Thanks, Katie. I think like Mike said, this is a huge question to address. And so I'll just be picking up on 3 things which we are observing and I think are very important in this conversation, which would be safety, diversity, and access. So I think what we're looking at in the Indian market is, number one, we are very concerned about the safety of AI applications in India, given the fact that oftentimes they are not developed at home and we do not have the necessary regulations or institutional capacity to oversee them in ways which ensure that consumers are safe. At the same time, we also have, there is a lot of companies and the government itself sees immense potential in the use of generative AI in bridging what was the access gap which we saw with digitalization. So as digitalization has happened in the last few decades, we've seen that it's worked well for some people and not so well for others. It's created new kinds of marginalizations, often exacerbating, the gaps that already existed in society. And finally, these access gaps also interlock very specifically with needs of diversity and how different groups are constituted and living in society, specifically for a country as diverse as India, where we have marginalizations along lines of identity, language, region, the rural-urban divide, and so on. So the promise of AI, I think, in several applications that we're seeing are coming up, definitely seek to bridge this access gap. And we've seen that through the development of large language models, which are trained on data from various Indian languages, for instance, right? So it tries to make generative AI a lot more multilingual. It's allowing for translations to happen across 15 Indian languages. And those applications can then be used to, create a whole lot of new kinds of services at the consumer end. These services include, for example, easing the interaction between the state and the citizen when it comes to delivery of public services, for instance, but also to open up greater opportunities for financial inclusion, for giving people access to credit and so on. So we very recently saw the launch of an LLM, which was trained specifically for the BSFI sector in India, where they're trying to make use of generative AI, which is trained on Indian data, which we were able to capitalize through the digital public infrastructure that India has been rolling out in the last few decades, and really use that data to make underwriting of loans and the credit market and the insurance market a lot more aligned and focused on creating specificities and personalized products for consumers. But at the same time, like I said, while there is tons of opportunities we are seeing, there are also new challenges which are emerging and existing challenges which can get very much exacerbated through these use cases. We are definitely seeing increased instances of fraud. I think one of the things which was very big in the Indian media here and has been for a while has been voice impersonation, which spread like wildfire because people could then very quickly use AI to impersonate people, and that created a whole lot of issues, especially in a market where people do use voice and video a lot more excessively than text. Right. So a lot of these factors of digital use then become exacerbated when we look at how AI can often make things a lot more difficult, and the ability for these systems to be used for financial fraud and so on. But at the same time, I think there are a lot of interesting applications, including for fraud detection, for creating more personalized products and offerings for customers, and definitely improving already existing markets and bridging access gaps.
Thank you so much, Tatisha. It's good to get a view there from what you see on the ground in India. We appreciate that. And I'm just going to move on to our second question. And I think that we'll all agree that we would love for systems, as we've kind of touched on already, to be accountable, to be transparent, to be fair and ethical. But that kind of leads us to some other questions, which we wanted to dig into a little bit on this panel, which is, who actually are we talking about when we talk about accountability? Like, who should be accountable? And if we agree that humans need to be accountable, then what mechanisms do we have to make those humans accountable? How would that work? And then also, how do we need to consider the role of that human being in this accountability? What's the context that we need to understand in that space? So yes, Megan, if I can ask you to start with talking to us a bit about how we think about accountability in a bit more detail.
Yes, absolutely. So I really like this question because for us, some of the considerations that we've had were, if we're building technology for law, and this is an area that's extremely regulated, we're providing a professional service here, is it really a question of use versus behavior? And what we've seen in kind of the generation of these new tools is when, we had all these splashy headlines from New York Times of the ChatGPT lawyer, everyone was asking the question, do the rules of professional conduct actually apply, or do we need to kind of change the architecture behind that? And when we engaged in a task force looking into specifically these rules of professional conduct, what we noticed is that actually the ABA rules still apply. And so if you're thinking about kind of the diversity of use in generative AI, what we're noticing is it's virtually illimitable use. And so the kind of existing parameters around what is use and misuse kind of don't really apply here, right? It's more about the application of the use. And so then it turns more specifically to behavior. And some of the outcomes of the initial task force we engaged in, we noticed that even though these rules still very much are fitting to how we think about this technology, a major problem is making sure that these rules are sufficiently tangible in how people are thinking about examples of consistent or inconsistent behavior. So what we've done in this task force is that we provided, for example, the duty of confidentiality or the duty of attorney-client privilege. This is an example of consistent behavior, and this is an example of inconsistent behavior. And then sort of that really materialized in many ways for a lot of people, like, okay, actually, I understand what my responsibilities still are. It just was a matter of application for me. And then from there, what we noticed was that the State Bar of California, for example, had adopted the principles of our MIT task force on responsible use of generative AI into their state bar guidance. And so it became kind of tethered to, this is the rule that still exists. And then these are ways in which, you can be sure that you're consistent or inconsistent with that rule. And actually, we worked very closely with Norm AI. We're starting to think about using supervisory AI so that you can train, a very small model on all of these rules of professional conduct, all of the existing case law around, say, the parameters of attorney-client privilege. And then it could live sort of local to your device and monitor all the times in which you're using generative AI. And, it might be concerning to say you've, violated attorney-client privilege, for example. So one thing that we've been looking at is personal identifiable information, for example. That's a sort of classic example. Say you're using ChatGPT and, you put in some information, there could be some sensitivity in there. This local model basically alerts you in advance and says, these are some things that, I would be, and physically will stop the other chatbot from responding. And so here you're sort of seeing this interaction of machines watching over machines. The other thing I think about a lot in this sort of space of responsible use versus behavior is almost what I call like the crashability standard. And so in one area that we've been thinking about as well is when, cars started to exist, it was sort of this fascinating way of moving from point A to point B. And I'm talking about kind of when cars as a technology first came about. But after a while, there was a question of, is it user beware, which is kind of the state that we're at right now? Or is there some responsibility still to the manufacturer? And so eventually, sort of, if we're thinking about regulators, right, one of the things that was petitioned for is, what are those safeguards that we need to think about? So at what point are we kind of starting to think about technological interventions as the seatbelts or the airbags? And I think that that's kind of the direction that we'll eventually be heading towards. We already have the technological toolkit, for example. We have guardrails, we have kind of regulatory AI as well. We also have LLM observability, and so monitoring some of those continuous outputs. And so I think, as we're starting to move into the phase of caution, I think out of fascination of the technology, that's sort of the pivot that we've been kind of exploring. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you, Megan. A couple of really interesting ideas there about how to actually kind of start to think about this in your own mind. I really appreciate your thoughts on this subject. And Mike, just quickly to go to you, and then we'll see if the rest of the panel have anything to add to this. But I do know that, again, this is a big area for the Alan Turing Institute and for you. So would you have anything to add to what Megan's saying about how we work through this accountability question, and who and how?
Yeah, well, I think actually Megan's response is actually quite fascinating. I hadn't really thought about, this working in the sort of this sort of policy enforcement area where you could actually use an LLM to help sort of support people in meeting their obligations. That's a fascinating example. But I actually want to bring to bear like a sort of a larger question. Maybe it's a bit of a more of a macro question about accountability, which is raises the challenge. And also Megan sort of touched on this, that like we haven't really acted to say hold car companies directly responsible for what their products can do, and that's just sort of a thing of history of how cars entered the world and how our sort of regulatory frameworks rose up around them. And we've done some work to sort of claw back some responsibility by requiring these technical measures. But now we see in the era of AI sort of a new face of this accountability. I don't know, it's not a crisis, maybe a strong word, but a new set of questions. There's an example, a recent example I like to bring up, which is the case of Air Canada, which got in a fair amount of trouble because they were using a chatbot on their in their customer service portal to provide helpful advice and feedback to their customers. And a customer used the chatbot to ask a question about getting compensated for like a family grieve, like their like morning grieving discount for airline tickets. Anyway, the chatbot gave the customer completely wrong information, which cost the customer a great deal of money. And then when the customer complained, Air Canada's response was, "That's the chatbot's fault. That's not our fault. We have no responsibility for that." And a court disagreed with them, and so they were found actually to be held liable for the failure of the chatbot. But one should not exactly be sympathetic to Air Canada for trying to dodge responsibility here, but it's possible they were also deceived a bit by whoever sold them or built them this chatbot, and they were convinced that this chatbot would solve all their problems and save them lots of money on human customer service agents and so on. And so they employed the chatbot, probably with good faith, possibly thinking that it was going to solve these problems and do all this work very well for them. And at the end of the day, they were left looking bad. And one wonders, like, well, maybe the company that made the chatbot should be really ultimately responsible for this. But this is complicated, right? Because now we have a whole chain of responsibility. You have the company that made the chatbot that may or may not have known its limitations, probably knew some of them, that has used various marketing ploys to try to convince a huge company like Air Canada to adopt the chatbot in a fairly important role. And then there's Air Canada that's made a choice to employ a chatbot to save money by over humans, employing humans. And then the chatbot, and then the consumer on the other end, who is, in Air Canada's view, meant to take responsibility for the information that they receive. And somewhere along the way, there's a whole number of questions that arise about who should be held responsible. I would argue that at the end of the day, that of course there always is a buyer beware aspect. We can't protect consumers against every single potential thing that happens, but we really ought to be mindful of the fact that we're using incredibly complicated systems that Air Canada obviously didn't understand the limitations of. So how could its customers have understood it? So in this case, it seems that the customers should not be held responsibility. Air Canada, yes, they should take responsibility for this because they should have done the due diligence. And I think that as we see AI being rolled out into more and more domains, like the legal domain, for example, or the medical domain, it will be incumbent upon professionals who are adopting these technologies in their domains to take responsibility and doing the due diligence before employing them to get the best information they can from the producer of the AI, which probably isn't them, and to act only in accordance with that understanding. And so they take some responsibility. But at the end of the day, there's still that piece in which the company producing the technology, particularly this complicated technology that even highly sophisticated, well-educated professionals working in other domains should have some understanding of, couldn't possibly be expected to understand the full ins and outs. And so this, of course, raises some very difficult challenges for regulators, but I think we actually need to look at this and say, well, we need to set levels of responsibility at these different role positions. We need to identify these roles. We have the producer, we have the implementer, and then we have the user, right? And we have a couple of other gradations in between that. But by carefully delineating, identifying and delineating these roles, we can look at each one and try to determine what's the level of culpability we can assign, reasonably assign to this role, and then move on to what's the level of responsibility we can reasonably assign. Now, I will just say in closing for this bit is that, you know, the legal profession has grappled with this for a long time, like in the move towards using cloud computing, for example, for storing sensitive documents, client files, and so on. There was a lot of concern in bar associations in the United States and in Canada and elsewhere about the safety of that and the obligations of lawyers to their clients for confidentiality and data integrity and so on. And ultimately, it was the American Bar Association that found that as long as attorneys did the due diligence of having strong contractual terms with the providers of the services, they had done their best. They had done the due diligence of holding the producer to account, and that they could turn to their clients, say, we're doing our best here to protect your information. If something goes wrong, yeah, we might be mildly liable, but we certainly aren't entirely liable for the damage that was done. And so that's an example in which responsibility roles can be set, roles can be identified, responsibilities set, and then acted upon. And everybody has a certain amount of certainty about what to do next.
That's great. Thank you, Mike. That's a useful perspective as well, to think about the different layers of accountability, as well as the individuals and their context and what they could be held accountable for. So thank you for those additions. And just in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to the next question. You know, we have a bit more time towards the end if anyone wants to add anything on accountability, but I'm going to ask a bit more of a philosophical question now. So moving slightly to something that is more an emotional response that some people have to this advancing new technology. So I wanted to ask the panel, like, why does it feel so tricky and so worrying to think about encoding ethics and responsible behaviour into a system? And, you know, why do we think that it produces such a lot of anxiety for people? And I think especially when we talk about people who have roles in the regulatory ecosystem, for example, it seems like a great challenge and certainly very intimidating. What do we think is going on there? Megan, if I can start with you again, please.
Yeah, so I really like this question because I think it touches, I think, very seriously upon, you know, this kind of paradox about people thinking, you know, regulators are hindering innovation in some respect. And I think a lot of what I see, and especially now with this technology, and this is something I think Teach actually touched upon, is there's so much diversity across our demographic that it's really hard to kind of work from a level of abstraction and to think about these broad overarching principles that are supposed to account for everyone. But I think the good news about the way that we're starting to think about the guardrails and safeguards we can put into the technology is we can get incredibly specific. And I think one of the things that's been fascinating for me is actually this interesting controversy of woke AI. So I don't know if many of you have heard of the news of Google Gemini, where when it came about, it was just impossible to generate a historically accurate image. You would ask and prompt the tool to say, you know, generate an image of a 1940s, you know, Nazi German soldier. And it would create sort of these like ethnically diverse soldiers, which is just not historically accurate. And I think in contrast, Meta then came out with Llama 3, which their approach, especially with their smallest 8B model, is let's not put any guardrails at all. And, you know, we actually had done some tests on the model, and we've noticed that it behaves incredibly egregiously if you want it to do so. So we had chosen an example of how do you push the model so that it could say the absolute most vile things ever. And so we asked it to role play as Jeffrey Epstein. And without even pause, it did so. And so the big question for me here, right, is what's this tension between, asking big tech to do that type of content moderation and possibly overcorrecting, setting aside and imposing principles across everyone, or, Meta's approach, which was let's not do any guardrails at all and kind of just let, the models roam free. And I think part of it is, well, if you're taking the approach of the latter, then you should very much allow yourself to understand how do you translate abstract principles of responsibility and accountability into highly tractable actions. And I think that that requires actually a lot of onus on the stakeholders themselves to know specifically their use case very well and how they're going to be ensuring that type of safety. And I think if that is the case, then very much I would probably advocate for using a model that is not only smaller, but also that doesn't have in existence some of these guardrails. On the other hand, kind of OpenAI, for example, they recently released their model spec, which is supposed to provide guidance on how they think the models should behave. It is, underlines sort of this objectivity as kind of like a necessary feature and things like that. But again, it gives the responsibility back to the tech companies and for you to sort of trust them to be able to put in the right safeguards. And so, when I think about this, again, it's a question of being able to not only understand your end users and the relevant stakeholders involved, but what they see as risks as well. So we've seen Guardrails AI, for example, they have put out there an open source library of 50 validators. These are sort of what they classified as risks. And then you're able to kind of determine whether or not that risk exists when you use certain models. But again, I think it's very much focused on who you think should take the reins on that type of accountability. So going back to sort of an earlier question, and Mike alluded to this perfectly. But yeah, I think for me, why it is so difficult for regulators is because we haven't really thought a lot about innovation in the regulatory space. And I think B, part of that innovation requires us to rethink the approach of going from very high level to actually going from the ground up.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Megan. Really interesting. Appreciate your response. We were a little bit over time on that question, but I did want to give Rachel an opportunity just to say a minute or so. I know that you had a bit of a perspective on this.
Oh, I would agree 100% with what Megan said. The only two things I'll add that I think are really difficult is one, that the tech is changing so rapidly. It's a full-time job to just stay up to date. So anytime you build a framework, it could quickly be outdated, especially if it gets specific with the new, Megan mentioned a ton of examples. So in the interest of time, I won't mention that. And then the other thing I wanted to bring up is that it varies so much depending on the use case, the audience, because whether you are coming up with a framework for people developing large language models or people who are just using tools off the shelf or people in the middle who are customizing tools for their own use cases, it's going to be very different. And then of course, like from an emotional perspective, the stakes are so high if you get it wrong as a regulator, that it would be very anxiety inducing to try to come up with a comprehensive list, because the reality is it won't be comprehensive because the tech moves too quickly and it's inevitable that you'll miss something. So we do the best we can with the information we have, but it's fair to be anxious about it.
Right,
And
thank you very much, Rachel.
I just want to add, just around this point on interpretation. So at NormAI, we build AI agents powered by large language models to help our clients interpret laws and regulations. And we see a very common pattern we see is that, well, you have a base regulation, but then almost everybody has their own overlay on it, something, their own policies. We're talking about a business and how they think about a regulatory set of requirements. And in no case are they less restrictive than the regulations. That would be, a policy about violating a regulation. We don't see that, but we do see much more restrictive regulations in many cases where policies in many cases, something might be permitted, but the business decides not to do it. And I think that's an interesting example of this, the challenge here, where the regulations they're not insanely comprehensive in every case. They don't detail all potential permutations of whatever the situation that they might apply to might be. And we see that in practice. And so we help, I mean, we will formally incorporate those into, the feedback that we give. And so people have our clients have their own tailored interpretation, but it just sort of helps, I think, illustrate from a regulator's perspective the challenge as well, because they're setting a baseline in one sense. And then there are levels above that. Again, rarely levels below that. I mean, that could happen probably by accident, but never really intentionally, as in our experience. And it just highlights the complexity here. So
That's great. Thank you for those additions, Patrick. That's really helpful. And kind of, I think that the responses to that question lead us quite well into the next question, which is much more a kind of practical question. And really gets to the heart of what we hope to discuss today, which is actually, it is complex, as we've just discussed in the last few questions, but how do we stop that complexity from making us completely inert and unable to embrace any of this new technology? And how do we start to overcome some of the anxiety that we just spoke about before by taking some steps forward, essentially, as different organisations who will be listening to this at the moment. So I wanted to ask the panel, how do we start? Like, what does it actually take to build or to use or to oversee AI and generative AI in a responsible way? How do we stay as safe and accountable as we can be? How do we mitigate as much risk as we can? How do we get started? What are the best places to start to stay as safe as possible as we embark on these journeys? So Rachel, I know that DataKind have done quite a lot of work in this space, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that one first, please.
Yes, there's so much. I could spend 3 hours talking about this, but I'll keep it to 3 minutes. I'll start with one of the most important things Megan actually alluded to earlier around really coming up with a narrow use case to target that safe solution. The broader it is, the larger the risks are in terms of accuracy, in terms of misuse. And so really figuring out what's that small way to implement it. For a lot of organizations, it's starting with tools that you already have and using the AI functionality that makes it a little more efficient. One example is a Zoom web meeting taking notes for you automatically, or having a little AI assistant to help you keep track of the conversation. Those types of small interventions can make a really big difference in productivity in an organization and are much lower risk than, say, on the other end of the spectrum, any type of tool that's directly interfacing with clients and has a free access to large language model to have a conversation. Those conversational interfaces that are user or customer community facing are much riskier for a lot of reasons. It doesn't mean never do them, but it's nice to start with those really narrow use cases. So one example of something DataKind's working on is a large language model that helps predict metadata for massive amounts of humanitarian data. For example, starting with the Humanitarian Data Exchange website, which has tons and tons of open data sets from a variety of humanitarian actors managed by the United Nations. But a lot of the metadata is missing. So that's the information about the data, making it hard to figure out what data source is actually valuable and which one you can actually use to get the humanitarian insight you want. So this massive open data source is not really accessible for anyone to use. And a large language model can address that by evaluating all the data, reading it all really quickly, and summarizing it, and in creating new metadata to get information about the data so that end users can go to the data and conduct the analysis themselves, keeping the human element at the center of the activity, but using the large language model to just speed up those really time-consuming and annoying tasks and in those narrow use cases. Another big thing to think about is limiting your data sources and always including references, especially with regards to mitigating against hallucination and any type of information loss or error. Megan, also mentioned some technical solutions that are helpful, including we've got RAG, HIDE, network graphs, a lot of different systems that are in place to limit your potential inaccuracies coming out. And so building those in, but never doing it without a human in the loop is really crucial to make sure you have someone fact checking and some type of system that limits the way that the tool can interact so that it's narrow to the use case provided. And those are all when you're thinking about use case. From a system side of things, thinking about data security and making sure that you're selecting a tool that protects the privacy of the data that you're using it with. You can set up all kinds of guardrails, like Guardrails AI is a great tool for observability, monitoring, red teaming, content filters. We don't have time to get into all of this, but those are the types of solutions that exist to minimize the potential misuse or model exploitation. And the last thing I want to make sure I mention is testing for equity and thinking about bias. That's something we haven't really talked a lot about in this panel, but we should at least think a little bit about what are the potential unintended consequences for certain groups and how is it treating different groups differently. Megan mentioned some examples from recent models, but anyone who's using it for a specific use case needs to take the time to think through the risks and the potential worst case scenarios for their specific use case, for their specific users, how interacting with that tool might be a different experience for people from different backgrounds, and doing tests for bias there. And I'll pause there in the interest of time.
Thank you, Rachel. And I know that you've got a lot to say on this. I know DataKind have done a lot of work in this space, so people should look at that and consider it as well if they're exploring this area. And that was some really useful kind of ideas about how we get started and some good examples there. Thank you. And Patrick, I wondered if you might want to add a little bit more, because I know that Norm AI obviously have been looking at what are the most appropriate use cases for your specific tool, where it's been most useful, and where are people starting?
Well, one area we focus a lot on is content review under different regulatory standards pertaining to that. And I think, I mean, obviously I'm biased, but I do think that when done correctly, the regulatory interpretation use case is a very strong fit for generative AI. You need to build the system in a certain kind of way. You need to be thoughtful about how you're decomposing the law. You have to have a lot of auditability and explainability in order to give ultimately end users confidence in the interpretations that they're receiving. And you have to have places where humans can review the results, of course, and intervene as needed, because there are many novel and complex situations that will arise. But it's an area where we've seen a lot of success, including in our own benchmarking, where we can see that we're performing at a very high degree of accuracy and able to provide sort of faithful interpretations of the reg as applied to the content. So, I mean, I think that is an interesting, and it's an interpretation use case where you have a certain kind of data that lends itself well to ingestion by LLMs. So I think that makes it unique and special in a way. A lot of it's very unstructured data. It's marketing and public content, so it could really look many and sort of there's a lot of variability there. But even so, you have like a sort of defined set of presentations in a sense, and that would be as opposed to maybe different use cases touching things that are happening in the real world or in the future, or that kind of thing. So it's a good area, we think, because there's sort of a series of archetypes, a series of types of content, and then a set of regulations that are not always completely in the market. There are different interpretations around them, but they exist. There is guidance from regulators. And so you can put all this together and then give people a way to faithfully apply the regulations to the materials that they're creating. So it has a few characteristics there that we think make it a great sort of way to apply this technology. And yeah, it's something that we, where we're seeing some good success.
Great. Thank you very much, Patrick. And Tiksha, I just want to come to you quickly, because I would love to hear what you think about use cases in the India market, and specifically knowing that you've gone a bit in depth there, if you wanted to add anything.
Definitely. Thanks, Katie. Just rounding it up quickly, I think I talked about some of these use cases earlier as well, but some things that we are looking at with a lot of excitement are um, use cases where we not just use cases, but also developing LLMs which are more focused on the Indian market and the Indian social cultural context, because that's a huge part of how we look at AI. And I think there's a lot of promising stuff out there on that front. Definitely, we're looking at language as a huge. So the Indian government built something called Bhashini AI, which is now being used for a whole lot of services, from public delivery to accessibility to finance, to making sure that people get developmental aid, they get access to public schemes, to educational services, and so on. But it's also opening up a lot of opportunity for technology companies and young startups in India to really start building products which are for the Indian market and reach not just the urban metropolitan centers, but also trickle down into your second tier and third tier towns. So that's one sort of thing we are definitely seeing. I think one sense which is existing in India at this moment is that we are exceptionally data rich as a country, and we are very use case rich, because we have a whole lot of developers and young technology graduates in the country who are getting very excited about AI. And the whole question is, what kind of use cases will they come up with which serve the needs of developing countries and global south countries such as India? I think very similar to how India looked at digital public infrastructures as a possibility of, building these open technology rails, which could help, help bridge the financial inclusion gap, which could bring in a whole lot of new, not just public service delivery, but essentially give that kind of support where private players could essentially play on top of rails which were built by the government or whatever public entity existed in these countries. The idea essentially was, how can we create open ecosystems for innovation, which are not private, because a lot of times private ecosystems were coming from big companies which are outside of the country. And oftentimes these countries, at least regulators, feel that they do not necessarily follow the laws, or we don't have the institutional capacity to really, rail them down and have them look at consumer interest. So when we've looked at that, creating ecosystems for public innovation, which are publicly held, owned, and interoperability is a very central sort of principle encoded into these digital public infrastructures. The UPI in India, for example, which has been touted as a global example of an open payments system and has been the backbone of the fintech growth that the country has seen over the last decade. With the DPIs, we are seeing a whole new set of intersections with AI now, right? So India is exploring something very recently which came out. It's called the Open Cloud Compute, where we're trying to understand how what are sort of local decentralized ways in which we can solve the compute problem, because we are a country that does not have compute capacity, and we essentially end up depending on big tech companies to gain access to those resources, right? So how can we leverage some of these at the decentralized level, and how can we create public rails onto which private companies, as well as the innovation ecosystem, can really plug in and play? And like I mentioned before, I think we're seeing a lot of interesting solutions coming up in the fintech space specifically, which look at better loan underwriting, which look at fraud detection, because that's a huge issue that we're dealing with at the moment, and also look at improving the customer experience when it comes to financial services. I'll pause there. There's a lot happening.
Thank you, teacher, so much, so much. There's just, I mean, it's a fascinating perspective as well. And I think actually really valuable to hear from you about like what's actually happening right now and what's the future use cases that you're looking at in India. It sounds like very exciting times. Thank you. So in the interest of time, I'm afraid we will have to move on to the next question. And I hope you don't mind, but Patrick, I wanted to direct this one to you because I thought you would have some ideas on this one. So I wanted to ask, what do you think the solution providers like yourselves specifically need, positive and responsible AI adoption? Are there anything that you feel that is needed from the regulators specifically?
Well, I think that there are a few things that would be helpful. I mean, certainly, at least when you're providing the kind of service that we provide at Norm AI, you need to be sort of very aware of how regulators are thinking about AI and where they're, what as best you can, what their perspective is on this technology in different spaces. For us, financial services primarily, but others. I think an opportunities to engage with them and help share what you're working on and how you're approaching solving the problems that you're solving. In our case, helping firms meet regulatory compliance obligations, but there are so many other great use cases where you'd have many different regulators potentially involved and interested and relevant. Just that opportunity to engage and to potentially even interact and just from an educational perspective, but also to build visibility. I mean, I think it's a very fast moving space with a lot of, there's something new almost every day, it feels like. And so I think you could, on the one hand, ask for clearer guidance, but on the other hand, I don't really know that anyone would be able to say exactly what that would be at the moment. So it would it's sort of wishing for something maybe that is at the moment, we're not quite there yet. We're moving fast to unlock the power of this technology, which is going to transform the world, already has. And I think what we need to do is just really stay flexible, have, of course, the oversight from regulators, and that's critical and certainly is going to be a fact of life. But just with an awareness that it's evolving very quickly. And so how that plays out in terms of specific standards, I would leave that certainly to the regulators, but just ensuring that there's that awareness that we want society to benefit from this in a responsible way, and that may mean taking some sort of different approaches when prescribing regulatory frameworks. And then I think it would also be very interesting and informative and help set expectations generally to understand how they themselves are using AI. Because they in many cases are, and I think it's just a good thing to know. And I'm not saying that oh well, you did it so we get to do it. No, that's not the point, but it is good to know how government and how regulatory bodies are leveraging AI today, because I do think that would at least set some kind of a benchmark for the for other participants in the economy. And so yeah, those are just a few thoughts on that. It's very important. We have spoken to regulatory bodies at Norm, and we think that's super important for us to do, and we always appreciate the opportunity to do so, and just think that scaling that up would be a great thing for regulators to do, as we're developing this technology very quickly. So
Right. Thank you, Patrick. Yeah, and I think, probably given the sort of speed at which things are changing and the complexity that we've talked about throughout this panel, it seems like that consistent opportunities for dialogue is actually one of the key things. And I kind of want to open that question up to the rest of the panel, but also kind of broaden it out a little to think about, okay, well, what do we think that we need potentially from the regulators in terms of a response to supporting ethical and responsible AI, but also like what are the other roles in the ecosystem that are important in ensuring that kind of ethical and responsible AI. So just open to everybody, but I do think, Megan, you had something that you wanted to say in terms of how the regulators may support responsible ethical AI.
Yeah, so I think given the approachability of this technology, we're seeing that everywhere, no matter kind of who's the industry or what's involved, people are trying to experiment with these tools. And I always say this is a bit of a fallacy of the oracle in a way, because it's presented to us in a sense that you can interact with it, it'll give you a response, and you can say all these things and expect some sort of answer. And I think at the end of the day, we mentioned all these technological sort of safeguards, such as RAG or guardrails and things like that. But these technologies are built off of probabilistic and statistical models, meaning that for 100% accuracy, for it to not hallucinate. That's just not possible. And so given our understanding of that and given the approachability of the technology, I think I would highly encourage that regulators just jump in and play around with the tool themselves. And part of the reason why I say this is because I think no matter what, they're going to be faced with companies that are going to be using this technology, whether they explicitly share, and likely they will share because, you know, it's a bit of a marketing strategy these days where if you splash on the label that you're using generative AI, and what we're seeing as well from the patent office at least is patent AI is going to be an incredibly significant use case in the legal space. And a lot of the concern of the, the patent office is, well, we might see a sudden exponential surge in the use of these technologies to file patents. So how should we respond? Because we simply are already pressed for resources. And so I think in the same way, sort of from a broader scope, regulators are going to have to use it if they're exposed to companies that are using it in one way or another. And so I think for us, it's, yes, user beware, but I think you can only see some of the limitations when you try it out yourself as well.
That's great. Thanks, Megan. Did anyone else want to add to what Megan and Patrick have already said on this topic?
I'll just jump in to say, to be transparent, since this is a process and we're all learning together right now, agreed with the opportunities for experimentation, sharing about those experiments, sharing about failures, so that we can really take a more agile approach to responsible framework development instead of assuming that something static will make sense, and providing those resources so that organizations can build their capacity for responsible and accountable and equitable AI alongside the regulations, I think will be really crucial.
Yeah, I just want to chime in to say that one thing I think that regulators can and should do is, I mean, there's actually a lot they can do. One is to enforce the laws that we already have on the books, the regulations they already have to hand. We're in a situation now where a handful of very small number of very large providers are entirely in control of the AI ecosystem. They're providing the models that are basically underlying most of the AI that regular people use, that like I've since ChatGPT, where anybody can finally go to the, to an internet, to a web page and generate their own LLM response. I mean, that was kind of groundbreaking in its own way, but Midjourney and the image generators have been out for a while, but now we're seeing an AI that is available to, at retail level, basically to anyone. And the regulators haven't really, I mean, regulators in some places have stepped up. There are copyright claims being levied against the major providers because of their abuse of the copyright system and their scraping of copyright protected content for building their models. And they're going to continue to do this because they're running out of data. There's just not enough data in the world to train these gigantic models. And the regulators need to act on this. They're doing it in some countries. They're doing it weekly in some places. But there's all this worry about restraining innovation and so on, which I think is a false flag. I think that really what's happening now is we have a certain amount of regulatory failure, particularly in the United States, where the major companies are situated and cited. Inaction that has been going on for a generation now to rein in the power of the technology companies that are having greater and greater impact on our lives. So I think that's the very first thing they can do. The second thing, the less thing they can do, the more welcoming thing perhaps they can do, easier to accomplish, is the creation of regulatory sandboxes, which I think people on this call will have heard about, which is developing a safe space for companies to experiment, to try out innovations, to see how do they match up with existing regulations, or what kind of regulations, what kind of regulatory holes do they raise up. And then finally, I just want to mention one more thing, is that something that is sort of an emerging area that may be helpful in this fast-moving space is to look at standards. International standards bodies have a variety of standards, both technical standards, but also practice standards that help to lay out the groundwork about how systems should operate and how people should operate them. And there's a lot of promise there. Existing standards, just like existing regulations, many of them actually do apply to, or can be applied to, artificial intelligence. At the Turing, we have something called the AI Standards Hub, which is a clearinghouse where people can go to look at standards that may have some impact on artificial intelligence and understand how standards may play a role in the future, particularly in a fast-moving space, of helping to shape the direction of artificial intelligence. Because generally speaking, we as a society do have a role to play in shaping the direction of this powerful technology. technology, but we need to be active on it, and we need to empower policymakers to be active on it, and regulators as well to take action to shape it for social good, and not just allow it to run amok and potentially create disasters all around us.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you everyone for your responses to that question. And one of the things that we've been looking at for the next session that we're planning on this subject is standards, in fact. So great that you touched on that as well. And that doesn't conclude our questions for today. I thought it was a fascinating discussion. I learn something every time I speak to this panel, and I hope that everyone who joined us walked away with something from this conversation. I want to thank our audience. We appreciate any feedback that you left for us for our next events. And also thank you so much to the wonderful panel. You can find more information about the panel on the CVent website, which is the website that you would have used to sign up for this session today. So if you're interested in something that someone's been talking about, look them up, find them, follow them, and learn more. And if you found this interesting, we're going to have this second session on the 11th of September, and we're planning to have quite a different session on the topic of AI ethics. I also wanted to just quickly mention that our CEO, Joanne Barefoot, has also recently hosted Nell Watson, who's an AI ethicist, on her podcast. So it would be great if people are interested in this subject, go and look up the Barefoot Innovation podcast and have a listen to Joanne and Nell Watson having what I thought was a really fascinating conversation. And very lastly, just a reminder that this is a series that we're putting out. There's plenty more content to come. And we also have a freely available white paper that you can download on the AIR website. So thank you all once again. And the AIR team hope to host you again at the next event. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.